of learning and understanding about the nature of consciousness and the structure of the human mind that Western science is just beginning to comprehend.
Tibet's spiritual masters earned such a reputation throughout Asia for their advancements of knowledge and philosophy that leaders of neighboring empires, such as the Khans of Mongolia and the emperors of China, became disciples of Tibetan lamas. In return, the emperors protected Tibet from invasion. Tibet was able to enjoy over 700 years of relative peace and prosperity.
Tibet was not a very advanced society, but our culture and religion is very deep and sophisticated. The living standard may not have been great, but we had enough to eat, and we never had people starving to death.
Tibet's era of isolation would end with the dawn of the 20th century. After Tibet was briefly invaded by Great Britain and then China, the 13th Dalai Lama formally declared Tibet's independence. Alarmed by communist persecution of Buddhists in neighboring Mongolia, he urged his countrymen to strengthen the army, but his modernization efforts were opposed by the conservative monastic establishment. Before he died, the 13th Dalai Lama left a warning.
We must guard ourselves against the barbaric Red Communists. Otherwise, it may happen that here in the center of Tibet, religion and government will be attacked, monks and monasteries will be destroyed, all beings will be sunk in great hardship and overpowering fear.
In 1933, a young boy born to a peasant family in northeastern Tibet was recognized to be Tenzin Gyatso, the reincarnated 14th Dalai Lama. Cloistered in the Potala Palace, he excelled in his studies of Buddhist philosophy and metaphysics, while the world beyond suffered the chaos of World War II, Indian independence, and the Chinese Civil War.
Chinese have always seen Tibet as part of its imperial sphere of influence. When the emperor was on the throne, the emperor believed that his right to rule the world extended to Tibet because that was part of the world that he knew of.
The Chinese argue that there were long periods in which Tibet was ruled by officials sent from the Chinese government.
The Tibetans thought of the Chinese as a separate people. The Tibetans are not Chinese. They have their own language. I was fortunate enough to speak both Chinese and Tibetan. I can assure you there is no connection whatsoever between the two. None at all.
Tibet had its own currency, it had its own government, it had its own army. It had relations with other countries. It signed treaties with other countries. And the Tibetans argue that those signs prove that Tibet was independent and should be independent still.
Tibet merely wanted to remain in its own self-imposed isolation. They had their own way of life, their own fervent belief in their religion, and they wished to preserve that and to preserve it untainted, without outside influences. Many is the time when I travelled in eastern Tibet particularly, I would meet pilgrims on the road, prostrating themselves the whole way, measuring their length. It would take them months or even years to travel to Lhasa.
What most people don't understand is that the invasion, occupation and colonization of Tibet is recent and it's blatant. And because in most people's imagination Tibet is something very far away, very remote, the immediacy and urgency of the problem is not understood.
What the West has done is avert its eyes while genocide takes place in Tibet. One of the specific violations of international law is the forced population transfer, the driving Tibetans out of their homeland. There has been a massive relocation of Chinese into Tibet. The ethnic cleansing has been underway in Tibet for about 20 years.
For an outsider, it looks that Chinese are doing a great thing to have hospitals, schools, road, electricity in Tibet. It's very hard for a Tibetan to say that I'm a Tibetan and I want to see Tibetan culture or Tibetan religion being promoted or preserved. This may lead him to face even imprisonment.
Lhasa, which means place of the gods, now has a red light district that stretches block after block for nearly a mile, servicing the many garrisons of Chinese troops stationed in Tibet. At least 658 brothels were identified by the Tibet Information Network in 1999. The Chinese are recreating Lhasa in their own image, erecting monuments to their version of history. Entire Tibetan neighborhoods are being torn down. Historic sections of Lhasa are being replaced with Chinese apartments and department stores.
The plans show a complete eradication of the traditional Tibetan quarters of Lhasa. The big temples remain, the Jokang and the Potala, but none of the traditional areas are there anymore.
Development is a double-edged sword because Tibetans need development and they want development. There's incredible poverty in Tibet. The Chinese move in to do the development. So in the end, Tibetans aren't benefiting much at all.
The Tibetans clearly want modernity and its advantages. They don't want the political repression, the political violence and the cultural destruction that goes with that. The things that are problematic for Tibetans are not cars, radios, televisions, faxes, brothels, karaoke bars. The things that fundamentally affect them are the lack of any control, any access to the government, to the party, to power, to economic process, to the ability to use their language and culture to make decisions about the future.
The worst thing for a Tibetan under the Chinese rule is that one cannot say that I am a Tibetan, as simple as this.
I'd heard all the stories of torture and all the problems of Tibet. I wanted to go see it firsthand. There are cameras at certain places on top of the buildings that monitor the people. Tibetans in Tibet are not free. There is not freedom of religion in the monastery.